Education today is excellent preparation for a job in the 19th century. This is not too surprising, really, in that our educational curriculum and the model in which we deliver that curriculum were both developed in the 19th century. There's only one small problem. We live in the 21st century. It takes 5 milliseconds to communicate with someone in Europe, not 5 weeks. It takes half a dozen robots to manufacture an automobile, not 100 factory workers. Everything has changed, except education. Now, I've spent the last 45 years in the university world, and so most of my remarks today will focus on that enterprise, but many of them also apply to education at lower levels. The model that we have is that there exists a bunch of full beakers, full of information. We call those teachers or professors. And then there's a bunch of beakers that have almost no information in them at all. We call those students. And the model consists of taking the full beakers and pouring little bits of information from the full beakers into the empty beakers, and then asking them to regurgitate it on command in proof that they have learned this information. This model is simply abysmal, both in theory and in practice. Let's start with the theory. For the first 150,000 years of human evolution, information has been limited, difficult to access, and expensive. Picture the 5,000 years ago, the shaman having to take the acolyte and spend 10 years giving him all the information that the shaman has learned about medicinal plants and magic spells. Picture the scribe in the medieval monastery copying carefully Aristotle's words by hand. Information was limited, difficult to access, and expensive. And if you want a specific date, say 6.5 years ago when the iPhone was introduced, that situation radically reversed. Information is unlimited, ubiquitous, and free. So the model in which education consists of pouring information from a full vessel into empty vessels makes absolutely no sense. All that information exists, and vastly more, in your pocket, and it's 2 clicks away. Nonetheless, we persist with this model. In practice, what we do is also just crazy. In particular, it's at war with about 2 million years of evolution of the hominid brain. How did your brain evolve? Well, it evolved to have 2 centers, Wernicke's area and Broca's area, both located on the left side of your brain for speech production and speech recognition. They're very close to each other, only a few centimeters apart, and they're very, very tightly wired together with neurons. In other words, your brain is hardwired for 2-way communication. So what do? We have someone who looks like me stand up here and talk at you continuously for 15 minutes without you being able to say a word. Secondly, your brain has huge amounts of real estate, the fusiform gyrus and half a dozen other areas, that are finely tuned by evolution over millions of years to recognize subtle social cues. If I'm standing close to you and I'm talking to you, I have parts of my brain that, unconscious to me, are registering the dilation and contraction of your pupils, the way your eyebrows are moving, the way your mouth is moving. They're picking up subtle social cues that allow me to interact with you more effectively, to anticipate what you're thinking, to imagine your intent, and evolve myself in a 2-way socialized communication. You all have to be quiet. You're not to talk to anybody else. If we have an exam, we'll leave 1 seat between each person. We completely desocialize the environment. Finally, and this is a little bit more controversial, but I'm convinced by the evidence, we have a brain that's wired for collaboration. E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard entomologist, spent most of his 50 years in academia studying those very rare examples of animal species, in his case insects, that are social. So he studied bees and wasps and ants and how their social interaction allows them to do things that individual members of the species couldn't possibly do by themselves. In the last 20 years, Wilson has turned his attention to that other species that's highly social, that is us. And last year he published a book called The Social Conquest of Earth. in which he attempts to explain how it is that for the first time in the 4.56 billion year history of this planet, we've managed to propagate a species with 7 billion large members who occupy virtually every ecological niche on the planet. And his thesis is it's a consequence of the evolution of this social human brain. And collaboration is a key aspect of this. Imagine how this evolved. You have groups. 5 million years ago in chimpanzees, 2 million years ago in the early hominids, 150,000 years ago today. All of those members work in small groups, 20, 30, 40, 50, hunter-gatherer kinds of groups. And Wilson has a theorem about this, which I find compelling. He says when you talk about natural selection, you talk about competition. And a selfish individual will always outcompete an altruistic individual. But a group of altruists will always outcompete a group of selfish individuals. A group where people understand that working together enhances the survival of themselves and their fellow creatures will always come out on top of a group that's constantly at war with each other, killing each other off. They are going to be lost from the gene pool. And so he argues that over millions of years of evolution of apes to hominids to Homo sapiens, that our brains are wired for collaboration. And so what do? We have an education system that focuses on and fosters intense competition for meaningless things we call grades. Sir Ken Robinson, the British educator, sums this up beautifully. He says, when a bunch of people get together and they work really hard on a difficult problem and they come up with a really creative solution to it, in university we call that cheating. Right? In life we call it collaboration, and that's really valuable, but in university we call it cheating. So what do? We have an education system based on a model of one-way communication in a desocialized environment that punishes collaboration. It's at war with the way our brains evolved. Now, why do we do things this way? Well, I think it's a consequence of two aspects of human behavior. One is efficiency, and the other is conservatism. Let's start with the latter. University faculty have this reputation for being flaming political liberals. You know, they're just way out there on the left wing of the political spectrum. But in fact, I can tell you from experience that university faculty are the most conservative species in the entire local universe. And as an astrophysicist, I can extend my analysis to the entire local universe. Everything from their perspective is perfect. How do they come to this conclusion in the face of this evidence? Well, it's called a selection effect. You see, little Davy was a good little boy. He was a goody two-shoes in first grade. He always sat there with his hands folded, and he listened quietly to the teacher to see what was happening. And as he went through school, he learned to do this better and better. He could concentrate for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes at a time. He got really good at writing down notes, and he would take them home, and he would type them up on his manual typewriter to make sure he had them right. And then he would get really good at filling in those little bubbles with number 2 pencils. This is before we had computer-based standardized tests, so we had to do it with the little bubbles. And he graduated from high school with wonderful grades. And then he got into a really good university, where by this time he'd managed to listen for 75 minutes in a row without losing concentration more than a couple of times, and he still took really, really good notes, and he could mimic exactly what the teacher wanted on the exams when he was asked to regurgitate, and it was going really well. That, coupled with some more filling in little bubbles, got him into graduate school, where he got on a path to a PhD, the process by which one learns more and more about less and less until one knows absolutely everything about nothing. And once he got his PhD, he was set for life as an academic. Now, of course, the things he learned nothing about and had nothing to do with education. He never taught a single student anything. He'd never had any course or done any research on the idea of how people learn, but nonetheless, he was perfectly qualified to become an Ivy League professor. And then he gets invited to give TEDtalks. So the system must be perfect. It took tow-headed little Davy and turned him into a famous Ivy League professor. We can't change a thing. It works perfectly well. Unless, of course, you realize that fewer than 1% of Professor David's students have any intention or any interest of going on to become Ivy League professors, and perhaps don't learn quite as well in that way. The reason, though, that even if you had this thought, this notion that, well, maybe this isn't the best way to do things, you really can't change it because of efficiency. I mean, it's just a whole lot more efficient for me to stand and walk around on a stage with light shining in my face and talk to 400 people than it is to sit down around a table and have two-way communication in a collaborative environment that's highly social with 16 students. And efficiency is everything. William Balmoral and Bill Bowen, who ultimately became president of Princeton, were two economists who 50 years ago wrote a wonderful paper on efficiency. They talked about what efficiency means in our economy and how efficiency works in manufacturing. Say you're going to make, I don't know, throwaway diapers or something like that. So what you want to do is you minimize your energy costs, you minimize your material costs, you minimize your labor costs, you sort of maximize the output, generate as much as you can, maximize your profit. That makes for an efficient 19th century manufacturing system. But they point out in this article that not everything can be made more efficient. And the example that I love is that it still takes 4 people 25 minutes to play a Beethoven string quartet just like it did in 1830. Hasn't gotten any more efficient at all. Now, education isn't exactly a string quartet, but it's closer to a string quartet than it is to manufacturing throwaway diapers. Education comes from the Latin root educare, educatus, which means to rear or to bring up, which of course education in the early years certainly plays a role in. But it also comes from the related Latin verb educare. Educare, E for out, as in ex, cathedra, out, moving out, and ducere from the word that derives from duke, to lead. That is, educare, to open up and lead forth. To open up the mind to new intellectual perspectives and to lead it forth to a lifetime of learning and creativity. Why aren't we doing that today? We've understood how this should be done for thousands of years, even for hundreds of thousands of years. Imagine that you're in one of these hunter-gatherer groups 10,000 years ago on the edge of the Neolithic Revolution. There's 40 or 50 people in the group, and 4 or 5 of them get to be 11, 12, 13 years old, about the time they really have to start contributing. And so what do? You have to teach them which are the good berries to eat and which are the poisonous ones, which are the roots that are medicinal and which are the ones that just taste terrible, how to set a snare to catch small animals, how to form a hunting party to go out and track down a zebra and kill it, and how to slaughter it and bring it back and roast it over the fire and share it for dinner. So clearly what you would do is you would take these 5, 12-year-olds and you'd set them on stumps and you'd lecture at them for 13 weeks. Right? Well, if it doesn't make any sense in that environment, why does it make sense when we're trying to teach people about rational choice theory or Shakespearean sonnets or river geomorphology? We're teaching the same brains. In millions of years, the brain has evolved. In the last 10,000, it hasn't changed much at all. Evolution doesn't work that way. And so, if it sounded absurd when I talked about it for the Neolithic young people, why doesn't it sound absurd today? The Confucian philosopher Shi Ji understood this 2,400 years ago. He said it very succinctly. Tell me, and I will forget. Show me, and I may remember. Involve me, and I will understand. So, what do? I stand up here with the lights in my eyes in a desocialized environment, giving you one-way communication, and punish you for collaborating. Tell me, and I will forget. Or we can do this in a fancier way. I could have had glitzy PowerPoint slides up here with movies and animations, or I could do it on a massive scale in the MOOCs, the massively open online courses. I could do it even better on that scale. Show me, and I may remember. Or I could create an environment in which the teacher and the student form a social unit, in which we sit around and have two-way communication in a student-centered, inquiry-based mode of education. Involve me, and I will understand. Thank you.